Hello and welcome to another edition of Truth is Making a Comeback, a production of LibertyNation.com. I'm Lisa K. Donner. On today's episode, an American citizen who was helping Border Patrol out in New Mexico was arrested this week. It now appears that he was assaulted in jail, and New Mexican patriots are hopping mad. We have two reports on this story. First, the political angle with Chief Washington columnist Tim Donner. Then we have Sarah Cowgill, who has been on the ground tracking this story closely and talking to everyone there. With special counsel Robert Mueller's report now public, what legal avenues will the Democrats pursue? And the left's fear of uttering the dreaded C word. Why is Christian so hard to say? All this and more on this episode of LibertyNation.com's News and Analysis TV program. A bad situation on our southern border got even worse this week with the arrest of the de facto head of the group known as UCP, United Constitutional Patriots. The man was arrested on a 2-year-old gun charge and thrown into prison, where he was promptly beaten up by inmates and sent to the hospital. Joining me now to discuss the situation in New Mexico and the latest with Larry Hopkins is Tim Donner. Tim and I have actually been married for 33 years, and believe it or not, we still talk to each other.
Yes, we do.
Hi, Tim. Okay, can you tell me basically what happened to Mr. Hopkins today?
Well, it doesn't appear to be, by most reports, very complicated. He went to jail, and word had spread among the other prisoners that he was considered a white nationalist, a fascist, part of a militia that was out to gang up and brutalize immigrants coming from south of the border. So once that word spread, it really was quite predictable that he would get attacked in prison. And in fact, he wound up in the hospital with broken ribs and apparently, according to his assistants in his organization, thoroughly demoralized by this whole chain of events.
So there has been some talk that Mr. Hopkins' arrest was actually a political arrest. What have you determined about this situation?
I think it's pretty obvious that it was political. They arrested him on a charge from 2 years ago that they could have gotten him on any time, but decided to go for it now, just when his group had sort of reached ahead in trying to assist the Customs and Border Patrol in basically surveying and being on the border and helping them with their work at in seizing immigrants coming over the border illegally. Their goal apparently has been simply to be sort of like citizens who would then make the equivalent of citizens' arrests of people who were in the country illegally. So what they're trying to do is basically just to assist the Customs and Border Patrol with what is undeniably a crisis. And I think the point of view of his organization is that if the Congress is going to do nothing to address the crisis on the border, then citizens like him will take matters into their own hands. And whether the law is on his side ultimately or not, we don't yet know, but it's clear. I mean, it's crystal clear that this was a political calculation to arrest him and throw him in prison. And I'm sure they probably didn't mind that he was beaten up in prison.
Do you believe, Tim, that, well, let's just say this. Who do you think put the FBI up to this in New Mexico?
Well, most likely the New Mexican governor, who is having a lot of trouble trying to control her populace now. They're not pleased about the fact that she is seeming to welcome immigrants, illegal immigrants from south of the New Mexican border in Mexico. And I don't know if you could say there's an uprising among the people in New Mexico, but they're very upset that swifter and sterner action is not being taken to control their border, because it's those people who live on the border in New Mexico and Texas and Arizona and California who are the ones who are paying the price for illegal immigration, while the rest of us say, well, we don't, but the Democrats are saying this is just a cooked up crisis. This is just something that Trump is ginning up in order to energize his base for the 2020 election. But if you look at the numbers of people coming across the border, about 4,000 a day, this is a legitimate crisis and could even be called, as President Trump has officially declared, a national emergency.
Do you think that basically Mr. Hopkins is in serious danger, and that if he was taken for a federal crime, why did they send him to a local jail? I mean, that's rather confusing to me. Or is this normal?
Well, he's been taken out of the hospital by marshals, apparently, who have custody of him. Last word we got. I suppose he's going to be targeted by pro-immigrant groups, pro-amnesty groups, pro-open borders groups. He will be targeted just as he was by the American Civil Liberties Union, which accused Hopkins' group of being a fascist, white nationalist militia, illegally detaining and kidnapping Central American families seeking asylum, innocently seeking asylum. The problem we've got, Lisa, is that now, unlike in past years with immigration, the illegals come over the border and they want to be seized by customs authorities because they want to seek asylum. They want to go through the process, which will keep them in the country. And most of the time, of course, they'll be granted court dates down the road, and so many of them never show up for court. And that's why you have the illegal immigration problem that we have now. 60% of the illegal immigrants here are simply overstaying their visas or came to the country legally but are still here illegally.
Do you believe the New Mexican governor set this up to cause this sort of powder keg? Because now we really have a political issue going on down there.
Well, it seemed that she wanted to make a statement, didn't it? I mean, there was no reason to arrest Mr. Hopkins otherwise. To say that some 2-year-old charge of a gun possession is enough to arrest him 2 years later, just when this crisis is coming to a head and just when the ACLU has targeted Mr. Hopkins as a fascist, white nationalist militia type who probably loves Trump, it's not a coincidence.
All right, Tim, thank you very much for your political analysis on the situation in New Mexico, which seems to be getting worse by the day. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Lisa.
New Mexico's controversial Democrat Governor Michelle Grisham has called the border crisis a charade that President Trump has concocted to rile up his base. Grisham even gave the National Guard the boot from the land of enchantment. A group known as the United Constitutional Patriots, or UCP, didn't appreciate the governor's cavalier attitude toward border security and stepped up to give the overworked Border Patrol a helping hand. And it seems that help was needed. Hundreds of arrests would not have happened if not for their presence. But then the FBI put the de facto leader of the UCP behind bars for a 2-year-old charge. Larry Mitchell Hopkins was put in jail where he was apparently assaulted by the inmates and then sent to the hospital. So what's been a bad situation in New Mexico has now turned into a powder keg. Joining me now is Sarah Cowgill, national columnist for LibertyNation.com, to shed some light on the situation at the border and specifically in New Mexico. Welcome, Sarah.
Well, it's good to be here, Lisa, as usual.
Alrighty, so what exactly has been going on at the border and for how long in New Mexico?
It's crazy town in New Mexico. For the past 60 days, they have had several different types of organizations down there helping out. In one 5-mile stretch, and this is where the drama comes in, one 5-mile stretch, the United Constitutional Patriots have been on hand monitoring, with the binoculars, looking for illegals, and then reporting to Border Patrol, and oftentimes asking them to stay put until Border Patrol can get there. And these people seem willing because they want to be caught. They want to have a foot in the United States, and they want to be picked up so they can be processed and then let go. They've been down there 60 days, and to date, they have helped round up around 5,600 people.
Now, in the media, they're referring to these people as militia, but as you mentioned, they don't like that terminology.
They don't like that terminology whatsoever. They call themselves citizen journalists, and they're down there mostly armed with cameras and doing live streams to show people, hopefully, that other people will pick up and watch what's going on down there. They really are doing mostly video journalism kind of things.
Is this the first negative encounter they've had with law enforcement?
Yeah, I think they get along great with Border Patrol. Border Patrol has towed the party line and said, well, we don't recommend, citizens getting involved in law enforcement. But they have, if Border Patrol wanted them out of there, they'd be out of there. The sheriffs have advised, all the county sheriffs, all the counties sheriffs in New Mexico have advised, hey, you don't want to be armed, walking around down there armed and looking for trouble. If you want to help, monitor from a distance. So the law enforcement seems to be, at least county-wise and federal-wise, they seem to be okay with the presence of these different groups. State government is the one that they're having a problem with.
You mentioned to me off camera that you've been on the telephone line all day with what seems like everybody in New Mexico. Can you tell us what you found out?
I spoke with a county manager in Hidalgo County, and we're just completely overwhelmed, and they've sent letters to the governor begging for funds. They've been basically ignored to a certain degree. Their last letter was out in December 2018, and then the new governor, of course, took over in January 1st of 2019. And they're finally getting a little bit of aid, and that aid is coming in the form of $3.1 million for radio communications. That's how desperate they are. That's where that money's got to go. And she told me flat out, if they had any kind of transportation system within that little county, that they just turn those people loose on them, and they can't afford it. They're just overwhelmed. I spoke with the San Juan County Sheriff. I mean, his county is bigger than 3 eastern states combined. And, he says it's all coming up north. All of this is moving across the border and coming up north and taxing the entire state. And he's seeing a big fallout. And his advice, and he knows Hopkins, the man that was arrested, his advice to Hopkins early on was, you got to take a low profile here. You don't want to irritate, your state, your governor, because nobody's right now appreciating that governor right now. Nobody in New Mexico is appreciating that governor.
But what have you been able to find out so far about the situation with Larry Mitchell Hopkins? And this is before he was assaulted.
Well, he's still behind bars, which I think is abhorrent. He's a 69-year-old, and I can't prove this, I can't find it anywhere, but he claims to be a 69-year-old Vietnam veteran. And, he's an American citizen. He's behind bars for an investigation that happened in 2017. It was in 2017 in Flora Vista, 400 miles north. And they haven't done anything about it until now. And they did it while he was down on the border with United Constitutional Patriots. He wasn't armed. He was just their camp cook. That's all he was doing down there. And they went down and arrested him. I mean, this is the state that released Islamic jihadists with the training camp on less bail than what this poor guy is going through right now, just sitting behind bars. It's crazy town in New Mexico right now.
You wrote an article for Liberty Nation that not one incident has resulted from a firearm discharge or bodily harm.
Nope. They render aid. They are on the front lines. They call Border Patrol. We've got a sick child. We've got heat exhaustion. They deliver water. They help these people out until somebody of authority can actually help them.
Let's go back to Hopkins for a second here. Is the problem that he has a prior conviction?
Yes.
So did he get in trouble before? What happened? Do you think the UCP was targeted by the feds?
He was arrested on for impersonating a police officer in 2006, which is apparently a felony, and that's what he got nailed on, and that's what has prohibited him from owning a firearm. His wife, his common law wife, owns several firearms, and that was the investigation in 2017. The FBI went in, disrupted everything, tried to figure out who owned what, and that was, almost 2 years ago, and now it's just coming to the forefront. I spoke with the United Constitutional Patriots spokesman, Jim Benvey, today at length, and he flat out told me, yes, this is definitely a hit by Governor Grisham and her, he referred to them as patsies, but, it's getting heated down there. This is a battle. This is a real battle. This isn't for the faint of heart.
Well, Sarah, how do you see this playing out for Governor Grisham and her pals in New Mexico? And do you know what you think this might mean for both the men and women on the ground who are kind of fed up with the state really not doing anything and the crisis on the border?
It appears that Grisham and her cronies, for lack of a better term that I can come up with, are trying to turn Larry into their poster boy for crazy white militia guy. It fits the narrative. But the UCP is comprised of all sorts of people, women, every color in the rainbow, Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, legal Hispanics, Hispanics that have just, recently immigrated. They have a Gold Star mom that's part of their group. I mean, these aren't nuts. They're not crazy people. They're not racist. They're just trying to help out in a constitutional crisis.
Thanks so much for your original reportage that you're doing on this story. And once more, you're going to do another, so stay tuned to LibertyNation.com and Sarah Cowgirls-Fine reporting on this story. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Lisa. Always a pleasure.
The Mueller report is now public in all its redacted glory. Volume 1 exonerates President Trump of any collusion or conspiracy with Russia. Volume 2, on the other hand, covers potential obstruction of justice. While Mr. Mueller once again was forced to admit he can't prosecute the president, he did lay out 10 examples of what might be considered obstruction of justice. A roadmap to impeachment, some say, and left the decision to proceed squarely in the hands of Congress. Have we finally come to an end of the Russia collusion narrative? Is this case closed? Or does the special counsel's wording provide a hook upon which the anti-Trump crowd can hang their hopes? Joining me now to explore the options left for the anti-Trumpers is Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Welcome to True, Scott.
Thank you, Lisa.
Well, as you explained in your analysis of this report, special counsel Robert Mueller's hands were essentially tied from the very beginning by a Clinton-era Justice Department memo that prevents the prosecution of a sitting president for obstruction of justice. So, how exactly does this apply to this investigation?
This is the memo you're referring to is in support of that rule, which is a Department of Justice internal rule set by the leadership of the department that says the president is not capable of being prosecuted for obstruction of justice, because to do so would violate the Constitution's prohibition on the separation of powers. Basically, the memo sets forth the reasons why then President Bill Clinton, this was a memo, Lisa, delivered to Clinton's Attorney General Janet Reno by a man who would subsequently become a Obama appointee to the federal courts. And I offer that just as evidence that it's not, a bunch of Republicans kind of making rules for a Republican president. So in any case, this rule requires that no obstruction charge against the president be brought because it would violate the separation of powers.
Okay, so the president can't face criminal obstruction charges while in the White House, but what about after his term is ended? Could the DOJ bring criminal charges against Trump later? And how might special counsel Mueller's report affect such a case?
Yeah, so as Mueller says in his report, while criminal prosecution of a sitting president is violative of current DOJ rules, the criminal investigation of a president is not. And that's how he was able to go ahead and proceed under those rules. And he was mindful and said in his report that a criminal prosecution might be brought against somebody who was president after they ceased to become president. The other thing is, Lisa, that a new leadership at the Department of Justice, a new president, new attorney general, could change those rules. So it's not a federal law or part of our Constitution that the president can't face those obstruction charges. That's the opinion of lawyers at the Department of Justice. So that could be further tested with a different president or a different attorney general.
Okay, let's talk about the 10 episodes, as Attorney General William Barr called them, which look to you as an attorney like possible attempts at obstruction.
Well, you know, the obstruction would come from knowing President Trump's, or before he became president, as a matter of fact, Donald J. Trump's intent for the various actions that he undertook. And then I'm not one of those people who necessarily thinks the president can be prosecuted for obstruction of justice. I think that it is the appropriate remedy if people believed he committed a crime to go ahead and proceed with what the Constitution provides, which is that Congress can then act and impeach the president, or some lesser censure or something like that. But to depend on the president, who controls justice, the Justice Department, who's in charge of making sure that the laws are faithfully executed, to depend on him to prosecute himself for obstruction, I think is a bit fantastic. And without knowing his intent for any of the actions described in the Mueller report, I would be hesitant to say one particular instance looks like obstruction rather than another.
But if Trump really wanted to obstruct or to put a stop to the special counsel's investigation, couldn't he? I mean, we heard about the potential for him to fire Mueller, Rosenstein, or even both. If he really wanted to obstruct the investigation, was there more he could have done?
Well, there are certainly other actions that he could have taken that would have been a heavier hand in retarding that investigation. Now, whether or not that would constitute obstruction, then we'd have to go back to the obstruction analysis, which would require, Lisa, I think, knowing his intent or casting aside the argument that a president could obstruct or couldn't obstruct. And I'm not willing to do that.
Finally, Scott, you wrote in your analysis, Robert Mueller gave a hostile Congress plenty of kindling. And we've already seen new calls for impeachment. Impeachment is, as you said before, a political decision. That said, do you think the House will initiate that process?
There's so much red meat out there, Lisa, for these attack dogs on the progressive left. I think it's going to be very difficult for those who have fanned the flames of progressive hatred against this president for 2 years now. Let's recall that they've called him literally, everything except for literally Adolf Hitler, right? He's a white supremacist. He's in favor of all these odious things. It's almost like, how could you then say, well, let's not go quite as far as impeachment? I'm not, the varsity level political analyst, but as I see those tea leaves, it seems like it's going to be quite hard for them to resist the full-on race to impeachment, and I expect that's what we'll see from the most progressive of the House members.
So in your estimation, is this Mueller report essentially mean case closed?
Well, there was never going to be a case in the first place, I think. So.
All right, so take it from there. All righty, thanks so much. Scott DiCosenza, Legal Affairs Editor for LibertyNation.com. By the way, Scott, you're looking really sharp today.
Thank you, Lisa.
And now for this week's parting shot. With Easter Sunday in the not-so-distant rearview mirror, it's worth noting that a few people in these United States still actually celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In 2017, Statista recorded that 81% of Americans commemorated this most holy of holidays. Despite the obvious popularity of Easter, some political elites on the left seem reticent to name it and claim it. That is, there appears to be a fear of mentioning Easter as a Christian holiday actually celebrated by Christians. There, it's been said, the dreaded C word, Christian. Those pitching their tents on the left can't seem to make themselves utter the C word. Many do verbal somersaults to avoid addressing it, writing about it, or publicly recognize those who laud Easter. Liberty Nation was first alerted to this odd assault on Christians by Patrick Hoff, who seems to be a rather savvy college student. Perhaps he isn't the progenitor of this phenomenon, but that's where we spotted it. Hoff astutely noticed that Hillary Clinton's tweet referring to Christians called them Easter worshippers. Then he did a taste test comparing Mrs. Clinton and former President Obama's tweet about the terrorist attack in Sri Lanka and the one at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Both referred again to Easter worshippers, as if they belonged to some sort of a cult. Naturally, this led to tongue-in-cheek tweets like this one from Liberty Nation's Jeff Charles. Can anyone actually tell me what an Easter worshipper is? Do these people worship the holiday Easter? Are they going to start calling us Christmas worshipers in December? What happens if a terrorist targets Jews during the same period as Easter? Are we supposed to call them Passover worshipers? Point taken, Mr. Charles. Why can't these politicians find the temerity to say the word Christian, even though Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama both claim to be followers of Jesus Christ? American politicians aren't the only ones jumping on the bandwagon to exterminate the C word. In the vernacular of British Prime Minister Theresa May, the attacks in Sri Lanka weren't on Christians, they were against churches and hotels. Perhaps surprisingly, London Mayor Sadiq Khan was able to utter the C word and even went so far as to put out a generous message about Christians. Still, some may take issue with Khan's reference to the Christian community who, quote, make an important contribution, unquote, to London. Skeptics might counter that Christians didn't merely make contributions to London, but in fact were responsible for the city's very existence. Nevertheless, we are willing to extend Mayor Khan some good old-fashioned Christian grace and let him slide on this one, since he demonstrated the chutzpah to actually say the dreaded C word. Of course, this isn't the first time the left has parlayed political views into a linguistic game of charades. Remember global warming? That became climate change. Next, illegal immigrants in the common lingo of the left became undocumented Americans. Here, we might take a moment to hearken back to the salient proverb of George Orwell. He said, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. Orwell could have added another rubric to language distortion that works just as well. Never write or say the word you despise, just put it on extinction. Then in a generation or so, people will ask one another, Christian? What is a Christian? And that's my parting shot. And that's it for this edition of Truth is Making a Comeback. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and hit our website, libertynation.com, where facts matter. Have a great week.
Truth is making a comeback. Visit us at libertynation.com.